Well, my clock is saying it's 3:10, so we should probably go ahead and start. I'm Tim Rumage. This is the panel on social equity with Heather O'Leary and Chris Uejio. We're going to be talking about some issues about resource disparity, heat impacts, climate change, and how those interact with social equity and how that interacts with sustainability. Each of the two speakers are going to take a few minutes to give you some background information. And then after that, we will open this up to questions. And so, Heather, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. So.
Wonderful. And I'm thrilled to be here. Let me take a moment to share my screen.
Okay.
Okay, can everybody see it?
Yes.
Right. So, are we all tree huggers here? When you think about the founders of the tree hugger movement, who do you picture? Do you picture brave counterculture hippies in Northern California chained to the redwoods? Do you picture middle-class, bleeding heart lawyers who shuttle between skyscrapers in the name of the canopy? The essence of my work lies here. Our cultural background not only frames our ideas about what constitutes environmental protection, but very alarmingly, who the protectors of the environment are and who they should be. I'd like to introduce you to the vanguard of tree huggers. In Upper India, Uttar Pradesh, in the 1960s, industrial logging along the China border was causing the typical monsoon rains to transform instead into devastating flooding with high casualties. Chipko, a Hindi word that means to cling, attach, or hug, began as a women's-led movement to protect their villages, livestock, and lives. The success of these brave, innovative, determined, and capable women spread across the country in the 1970s and 80s. Later, Indian anti-dam movements would follow with the same techniques of resistance. Chipko, or tree hugging, was a pivotal precursor to India's environmental movements, and behind it was the clarity, strength, and intelligence of everyday women. Yet, the recognition of their contributions has become lost in today's narrative about environmental deterioration and disaster, including sustainability and climate change. The fact is, women in the global south are framed as victims, facing multiple layered vulnerabilities from identity discrimination. Today's depictions of women in the global south, and this is a term that we scholars use for third world or developing nations, it often robs these active agents of not only their dignity, but their capacity to dramatically change climate conversations and realities. There's a lot going on in the world today, and addressing environmental and structural injustices is more important than ever. We learned that at the COP meetings. But the world is just waking up to the ways the environment and identities like gender impact each other. I direct the EcoFem Lab, a data-driven research tank at USF that's devoted to understanding how the physical, material, and biological things we rely on for basic life are indeed social. Water isn't apolitical. Through water, like through trees, we see that all manner of power relations are played out. Water is a substance imbued with the essence of who we are, our politics, our economy, our religion, our gender identities. And since most effects of climate change are examined through dramatic changes to water, climate change is repoliticized, not just by who's contributing to the most to its causes, nor who's absorbing most of the risks. But this is a key point. It's also to who is stuck in the everyday politics of resource management. And that means that climate change and sustainability is squarely a women's issue. The causes, the effects, and even the ways we think about climate change and sustainability are intrinsically rooted in who we are in this world. The differences that make us individuals, living diverse lives, sharing different and similar backgrounds, interests, and cultures. Cultures teach us what it means to be a person and a woman. They also teach us what it means to be sustainable. I want to emphasize a key point about gender and environmental activism. The way we talk about women affects the structural barriers our society creates. Sexist, discriminatory structural barriers are not only dangerous socially, but they rob the world of a vast toolkit to combat climate change. As the world wrings its hands and expects high-tech scientific innovation, often depicted as led by white, English-speaking, middle-class men with the privilege of advanced degrees, it ignores, one, that these tech solutions will always rely on the labor of diverse contributors across sectors and across scales, people who are also heroes of our planet. And two, the hope for new solutions is overlooking a vast wealth of ideas already in progress by diverse, non-traditional leaders of environmental innovation. Leaders like the Chipko protesters or the women in India's water-scarce slums. Let's reframe this by drawing from our own backyards. Florida is one of many areas in the world considered climate sacrifice zones, vulnerable to sea rise, hurricanes, urban heat, and myriad dangers. Our economy will have to endure physical risks like stranding assets and social risks like migrations changing livelihoods and changing lives. And as I know you all are, as engaged citizens, we know that these threats already affect people in our communities differently, including women, and especially intersectionally, meaning through the layered identities of women like race, age, education, economic opportunity, and so forth. Climate change risk affects everyone, just not equally. Another key point I want to emphasize is that understanding gender differences in communities is not simple. A diversity of perspective can be helpful and a source of understanding the existing strength and resilience that's not evident to outsiders. Anthropologists like me are able to see problems from an insider's perspective, to decode the seemingly meaningless aspects of everyday life that add up to big structural barriers to change. By bringing together ethnographic methods and rooting them in big data techniques, then tracing the cultural dimensions of our decision-making, we learn that the key to resilience and sustainability may be in acknowledging existing gaps in systems and better accounting for those gaps. Community differences are not simple. I learned this in India, where I have over 15 years of experience studying water politics in an informal settlement slum community, or basti. What I must emphasize is that people's relationship to water changed according to who they were and how their identity structured their life. An older Muslim widow raising children on her own struggled with tanker deliveries during a call to prayer. A new Hindu bride struggled to lift her vessels in her veil. Daughters were pulled from school so their mother could keep their jobs as domestic workers to pay for their sons' tuition. Who you were affected water access, and that affected economic advancement into the next generation and the generation beyond that. But I must emphasize that it also needed innovation beyond the purview of water scientists. This relationship to water is also evident in our backyard in Florida. Water is so much more than a natural resource. It's the fluid that allows our economies to flow, from the sun, sand, and surf industries associated with tourism, to our lush agricultural industry, ports of international trade, and the sinks and labs of critical health and life sciences. And the people working in every sector who rely on the simple privilege of turning on a faucet. Take, for example, the layered risks of water in Tampa Bay. When I examine the record of Southwest Florida's harmful algal blooms, I see formal and socioeconomic costs like decreases in revenue. But I also see how people make micro shifts in their private lives to accommodate new economic challenges. With our NOAA grant, my UCF partner and I are combining physical, economic, and discourse or social data to develop a historical model or a hindcast of the red tide event. We're integrating the records of indicators of marine distress with economic distress and social distress expressed on social media. This may help politicians secure relief funding sooner and help us learn what social messages can help prevent and mitigate red tide. With a grant from USF, I'm bringing broader questions about sector and county economic resilience into our own living rooms. Rooting this in questions of extractivist economics is something that we explore in the EcoFem Lab. And my research assistants and I are combining anthropology and social media data mining to document precisely how red tide has ripple effects in everyday families' pocketbooks, and how female-headed households are responding differently. And if anybody is interested, I can also tell you about the Moat Marine Labs grant that the EcoFem Lab is also working with to figure out how to best protect the Florida Reef Tract through social media data. The environmental threats to industries magnify here in Florida in specific homes, demonstrating class differences, and also among people within families, gender transcending class. This is where it becomes evident that women in Florida are already unevenly reaping economic losses due to environmental risk through the default, repetitive, and reproductive labor of the simple act of making a home on the verge of climate change. In closing my opening remarks, I'd like to encourage you to start thinking like an eco-feminist, like an intersectional investigator, examining people's layered identities, like a structural sleuth, exposing challenges and opportunities in our socioeconomic systems to be more inclusive. By acknowledging this, we can move forward in a more just, inclusive, and resilient tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Chris, you've got a presentation you want to do, I believe, dealing more with looking towards the future a little bit about heat issues and how that's also going to parallel this issue of differential impact in the community. Would you like to go ahead and present?
In some ways, they might seem like disparate topics, but I certainly can start to see why these two talks were together. So bringing this a little bit closer to home, talking about social equity and extreme heat. Given the audience, it made a lot of sense to talk about Sarasota itself specifically first. You folks know a lot more about Sarasota than I do, so slightly strange for me to mention that. But that being said, we'll talk a little bit about a pretty neat project that the Department of Health there has worked on for the past few years. And then I'll talk a little bit about extreme heat in Florida with sort of an eye towards equity. So the Sarasota County Department of Health has worked on this Building Resilience Against Climate Effects program, which is a Centers for Disease Control and Prevention funded program. And they've modified it a bit. So instead of having to brace for impact in order to increase one's resilience, they've added this emergency management or EMBRACE acronym. Essentially, maybe the best way to build resilience is not necessarily bracing for an impact, but embracing one another or building societal or cultural connections. Some things about Sarasota, you folks again know it better than I do, but some of the lesser known estimates, some of these are estimates more than sort of factoids. But the larger proportion of older adults, there of which 11% have some sort of access and functional need. A few percentage have some sort of serious debilitating mental illness. A large proportion of people who are older adults, most people don't consider themselves elderly, but over the age of 65. In which case we have a fair amount of people who rely on a standard supply of energy or electricity, who are oxygen dependent, people who have cognition and memory issues. So just jumping right into it, the Sarasota County Florida Department of Health, I'm going to introduce two of their sort of projects that they worked on. The first one was mapping critical infrastructure facilities here against storm surge from kind of different hurricane strength categories. There's a lot going on in this figure, but I'll walk you through it. First here, in these colored dots are your critical infrastructure facilities as defined by common federal government classifications, but essentially these are things that are critical for not just an individual household, but for a wider set of community members. As you folks know as well, here in the yellow, this is the storm surge, what we would expect to see from a Category 3 storm, and we know as you don't need a Category 5 storm to inundate a large proportion of the area. Here in these black boxes are areas that we would consider at risk, or essentially comprised of people that have socio-demographic characteristics that limit their agency to adapt or respond, to evacuate, things along those lines. So Dr. Carol Jeffers, who led a lot of this work, and who's I'm crediting for presenting this material, held a couple of workshops in 2015 to 2016, these Embrace workshops. There are 3 held across the county. And what I thought was pretty wonderful about these workshops was she essentially recruited and engaged representatives of access and functional needs groups, or those that are historically disadvantaged in some of those areas that I had just highlighted on the map. So those could be transportation disadvantaged, it could be the unhoused, it could be older adults, people with access and functional needs. And there was representatives participated in workshops, provided feedback on the maps I just showed you, as well as reported some of their challenges that they thought their clients or the people that they worked with would face, particularly with a focus on communications and transportation. And I'll walk through a few of these just for the moment. So for emergency communications, there were some challenges with understanding. Low literacy, obviously there's still multiple languages, cultural appropriateness, having an actual hearing, vision, or mental health impairment that would limit your ability to understand that. Pretty clear to understand today, rumors being equally important to official messaging. Access, obviously if there is a disaster like a hurricane strike, having cellular infrastructure that's damaged or offline, and some groups that who not be able to access or just don't traditionally tune into mainstream media, they don't have a NOAA weather radio, it's hard to reach them. Transportation challenges, some direct effects of roads being closed or congested, some inadequate evacuation signage. So knowing when's evacuation zone is a challenge, and knowing when to evacuate is a challenge. Public transportation, as you folks know, Sarasota didn't always have public buses. So that is a challenge for some people if they no longer have a car or have access to their own personal motor vehicle, to be able to evacuate. If it is a mass evacuation, do they feel comfortable taking a bus? Obviously, lack of funds to evacuate being a challenge as well. What was perhaps pretty neat or notable about these workshops is that in addition to proposing these challenges, they also propose some solutions. So for example, for public transportation, some of the workshop participants suggested, well, we can practice, have a day where we practice going through the bus, where we can have people bring a bus, practice getting on, know how to work with it, and not feel as nervous about evacuating through that option. So switching gears a bit to extreme heat in Florida. This is a question, but essentially extreme heat contributes to how many deaths in the United States per year. So to help with that, extreme heat is the #1 cause of weather-related deaths in the United States. Globally, it's flooding, but in high-income nations, it's extreme heat. So feel free to toss in some answers to the chat, just since I'm not able to multitask. I'll have to look at them a little bit later, but just to make this a little bit more interactive.
Did you have more, Chris, or are we?
Yes. So in terms of the chat, let me switch back, see if we have anyone tossing them in. Okay.
of 160 a year.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for sharing. Again, apologies for the multitasking or lack thereof. Okay, thanks for the number. So it's actually higher. It's at least 12,000. I know that seems like a really huge number, but there's a variety of ways we can calculate that, and that it's at least 12,000 per year across the United States. Does that mean that you suddenly find thousands of people on the floor? No, it's that on these hotter days than normal, we are seeing people die of respiratory, cardiovascular, or a variety of heat-sensitive conditions. So who's at risk? Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Older adults, people with pre-existing health conditions, infants and children, pregnant or expectant mothers, people who are low income or the unhoused, or people with higher outdoor heat exposures like athletes or outdoor workers. So we can create some of these maps to figure out essentially who has the highest heat sensitivities across the state on average. I know these are county level maps, so they're not particularly super informative, but we are able to provide some insight into sort of the socio-demographic characteristics of those people and places with higher heat-related illnesses. As you'll see here, right, certainly your study area has some of the highest sensitivities to cardiovascular and respiratory disease triggered by extreme heat or exacerbated by it. So why is that? Largely due to having a large proportion of older adults, and that's fairly intuitive. Here, older adults in nursing facilities, this isn't saying that it's just those adults in the nursing facilities, but those places with a larger number of nursing facilities also tend to have just older demographics. Here, just to tie into the previous talk, children living in one-parent, largely female-headed households also have higher risks, as well as those under the age of 5 years. Largely, since children have more difficulty communicating, and they have smaller body sizes, so it's harder to dissipate heat. So this brings us to the equity piece and rethinking about air conditioning. I think it's really easy to think of the environmental dimensions of air conditioning, and that as the world's going to get warmer and hotter, that more people are going to need it and get a sense of dread, perhaps particularly from the environmental side. But that being said, air conditioning, for better or for worse, is our most effective intervention to prevent people from dying from heat. So maybe it's time for us to rethink air conditioning. If it has to be deployed in an energy efficient manner or in a way that doesn't encourage overuse. We know from an AARP survey that the poorest households that qualify for energy assistance spend about 60% of their income on air conditioning, and that's similar to the amount that you spend on food or transportation. And across Florida, and what are the characteristics of the places that are more like, essentially that are more likely not to have air conditioning? So this is a positive number. These are the characteristics of those that have more likely not to have air conditioning. Both sort of urban core areas, as well as rural areas, are more likely not to have air conditioning. Older households with older adults, also more likely not to have air conditioning. African American households. So thanks for your time. I look forward to your thoughts and questions, and appreciate the invite.
Well, thank you both very much. We are a little bit tight on time here, so just a couple of questions. Chris, with the heat issue, is it purely heat, or heat and humidity? Do they play a combination role, or how does that work?
Yes, great question. So both are important. The heat and humidity, essentially, particularly where we live, being humid limits the ability to sweat, which is our most effective way for our body to cool down. And that's actually when things are so humid that sweating becomes ineffective is when things start to get really dangerous.
So that means that as temperatures rise, not only is there going to be more heat, but since warmer air can hold more moisture, we're also likely to see a magnification of the combined problem, right?
Exactly right.
Yeah. And Heather, your presentation talking about where earlier on you were talking about women being seen as being portrayed as victims. And I think in one conversation we're having, we were talking about how in reality, many of the women are actually the people who have the greatest experience in how to resolve some of these issues, because they've dealt with them more directly than anybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. So typically in this culture of fixing environmental problems, we say we need to train scientists and get them through the STEM pipeline so that they can start building the solutions of tomorrow. And while that's very important, it's also important to recognize that there are so many millions of people right now who have already started to build mitigation for cities that are overburdened, for climate disaster and resource insecurity. And so instead of solely thinking about sustainability as like a high-tech, high education type of option of that long-term pipeline, we can also think about reframing all of these people who have the solutions right under their noses.
And I would also think that since the trends are for global warming to be happening at an ever faster rate, that waiting till we get everybody through all the years of education we think you need to come up with technological solutions, there'd be some real advantages to doing a much better inventory of what the local knowledge in different places already is, that we could use and apply.
Absolutely. And I see one of the questions, what low-tech solutions are there to adapting to the heat? Well, in my field site, in one of the Bastia of Delhi, it's an informal settlement community. These people would run out of water if they didn't get water tanker deliveries every 3 or 4 days because they had to haul water all by themselves. You can think about urban heat islands and how lots of formal construction increase the amount of heat that a city packs on throughout sunny days, throughout entire weeks and summers. But you can also think about the green areas of the city as sinking some of that heat. So in the Basti, we had a lot of small and modest homes. They were constructed using wattle and daub or like hand-built bricks. So their heat retention was lower than some of the larger structures in some of the overbuilt middle-class areas. But they also were very smart to make sure that they kept lots of green areas as like essentially heat barriers in the city. And wouldn't you know it, even after 4 days of a water tanker not delivering water, people were still sharing their very vital drinking water with the plants in their community. In the middle class areas of Delhi, people weren't watering their trees that much, and they sure as heck weren't going out onto public land that the city was supposed to water and watering those plants themselves. So that's a really low-tech solution, is just thinking about the urban heat island and not looking towards the greater political systems or not looking towards high-tech systems, but thinking about what you in your neighborhood and what you and your household can actually do to make a difference. And that's something that, is a piece of making a change.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. But given the time, I think we'll have to end there.